On the stormy night of November 14, 1855, the heavy oak doors of the Sterling Plantation in Savannah, Georgia, were locked from the inside. The house, usually bustling with the noise of servants and the shouting of its master, stood in an unnatural, suffocating silence to anyone passing by on the river road. The scene through the large bay windows looked like a celebration. The master of the house, Silas Sterling, sat at the head of his mahogany dining table. His wife Victoria sat to his right, and their 3 adult sons occupied the remaining chairs. The crystal chandelier was lit, the silver polished, and the wine glasses full, but there was no movement, no conversation, and no breath. When the local sheriff, Elias Stone, finally broke down the door the next morning, he was met with a sight that would force him to resign from his post less than a week later. In his official report, which was sealed by the state of Georgia for nearly 70 years, Thorne described a scene that defied all medical logic. The 5 members of the Sterling family were not slumped over their plates or lying on the floor in agony. They were sitting upright, their muscles locked in a state of absolute rigidity. But it was their faces that haunted Sheriff Thorne until his dying day. Silas Sterling, a man known for his violent temper and perpetual scowl, was grinning. His lips were pulled back so tightly that the skin at the corners of his mouth had split. His wife and sons wore the same grotesque expression, a wide, unblinking rictus of joy that reached all the way to their dead, terrified eyes. They had died in agony, yet they looked like they were sharing the funniest joke in the world. And in the center of the table, sitting on a pristine white lace doily, was a small, hand-blown glass vial. It was empty, save for a single drop of amber liquid that smelled faintly of peaches and sulfur. Before we unravel the mystery of the smiling poison and the dark figure who placed it on that table, we need to understand why the silence of the Sterling family was prayed for by hundreds of people across the state of Georgia. This isn't just a story about murder. It is a story about a cruelty so deep that it demanded a chemically perfect revenge. But first, if you are fascinated by the dark secrets buried in history's shadows, make sure to join our community. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We dig up the stories the history books try to hide. And let me know in the comments, do you believe that some crimes are so evil the law isn't enough to punish them? To understand the death of the Sterlings, we must go back 6 months to the arrival of a woman named Elara. She did not come in chains, and she did not come with wealth. She arrived at the Sterling Plantation with a carpet bag in one hand, a letter of recommendation in the other, and a knowledge of botany that was about to change the history of Savannah forever. Elara arrived at the Sterling estate under the guise of a specialized nurse. The mistress of the house, Victoria Sterling, had been complaining of nerves and phantom panza, fashionable ailment for the wealthy women of Savannah, usually cured by laudanum and attention. Elara, with her pristine references from a reputable Charleston hospital, seemed the perfect solution. She was quiet, efficient, and moved with a grace that allowed her to slip in and out of rooms without being noticed. To Silas Sterling, she was nothing more than a piece of furniture, a tool to keep his whining wife quiet. He didn't look at her twice. This was his first fatal mistake, because if Silas had looked closer, he might have noticed that Elara's hands were stained slightly yellow from handling sulfur. He might have noticed the way her eyes didn't lower in submission when he entered the room, but instead tracked him, cataloging his movements, his habits, and his weaknesses. Elara quickly learned that the Sterling Plantation was not just a farm, it was a prison disguised as a home. Silas Sterling was a man obsessed with control, but his particular form of cruelty was unique. He detested noise, He hated the sound of joy. On the Sterling grounds, laughter was a punishable offense. A hummed tune could result in a whipping. Silas believed that silence was the sound of discipline. He ruled his 400 acres with a terrifying quiet menace. He rarely shouted, he didn't have to. A simple point of his cane was enough to send a man to the correction barn, a windowless structure on the edge of the property where screams were stifled by thick insulated walls. But Silas wasn't the only monster in the house. His 3 sons Theodore, Julian, and William had inherited their father's cruelty but none of his discipline. They were chaotic, bored, and sadistic. Theodore, the eldest, fancied himself a scientist. He would often trap stray dogs or farm animals to test endurance limits, leaving their carcasses in the woods for the other servants to find. Julian and William treated the plantation's workforce not as human beings, but as toys for their amusement. Elara witnessed it all from the upstairs window of Victoria's bedroom. She saw the sons racing horses through the workers' gardens, trampling months of food crops just for the thrill of seeing the devastation. She saw Silas strike a stable boy across the face with his cane simply because the boy had sneezed while holding the master's horse. And she saw Victoria Sterling, the woman she was hired to care for, watching from the balcony with a glass of sherry in her hand, indifferent to the suffering below. Victoria wasn't a victim of her husband, she was his enabler. She would often complain that the crying from the barn was giving her a migraine, asking Silas to ensure the punishments were done more quietly, not that they be stopped. For 3 months, Elara played her part perfectly. She mixed soothing teas for Victoria. She organized the medicine cabinet. She became invisible. But at night, while the house slept, Elara was working on a different project. She had discovered an old, neglected greenhouse at the back of the property. It was overgrown, filled with shattered glass and weeds. But hidden amongst the debris, Elara found exactly what she had been looking for, what she had traveled all the way from New Orleans to find. Growing wild in the humid Georgia soil was a rare invasive species of hemlock, specifically Oenanthe Crocata, often known as water dropwort to the untrained eye. It looked like wild celery or parsley. But Elara knew its true nature. She knew that the roots of this plant contained a neurotoxin so potent, it attacked the central nervous system within minutes. But it didn't just kill, it caused a violent contraction of the facial muscles. It forced the victim's face into a horrific, permanent smile. The irony was not lost on her. Silas Sterling, the man who forbade laughter, the man who silenced an entire plantation, would die wearing a smile he couldn't control. But Elara wasn't ready to strike yet. She needed a catalyst, a moment that would justify the total annihilation of the family. She needed to be sure that not a single member of that bloodline deserved to live. And on the afternoon of October 31st, 1855, the Sterling family gave her exactly that reason. October 31st, 1855, All Hallows Eve. In the slave quarters, hidden behind the line of weeping willows that separated the help from the house, there was a brief, fleeting moment of normalcy. A young girl named Cassia, the 7-year-old daughter of the plantation's cook, had managed to carve a face into a discarded pumpkin. It was a crude, lopsided face, but when she lit the candle inside, it glowed with a warmth that the Sterling estate had lacked for decades. For the first time in her life, Cassia forgot the rules. She clapped her hands, and she laughed. It wasn't a loud sound, it was the innocent, high-pitched giggle of a child delighted by a flickering light. But on the Sterling plantation, sound carried. Silas Sterling was on the veranda, enjoying his evening cigar. He heard the laughter. To him, it wasn't joy. It was a transgression. It was a crack in his perfect silence. He didn't call the overseer. He didn't shout. He simply walked down the steps, his cane tapping rhythmically on the stone path, and headed toward the quarters. His 3 sons, bored and looking for evening entertainment, followed him like wolves trailing an alpha. Elara watched from the kitchen window. She didn't see exactly what happened behind the willow trees, but she saw the aftermath. She saw Silas return to the house, wiping a speck of mud from his boot, looking satisfied. She saw the cook, Kasha's mother, running toward the river, her mouth covered by her hands to stifle her own screams, terrified that if she cried out, she would be next. The laughter had been extinguished, but in its place, something far more dangerous had been ignited. Elara went to her room. She didn't sleep. She opened her leather satchel and took out a small, leather-bound journal. She didn't write a diary entry. She wrote a formula. She realized that saving Cassia or comforting the cook was a temporary fix. As long as the Sterlings breathed, the terror would continue. The sickness of this house wasn't nervousness or gout, it was the family itself. And Elara was the cure. The preparation of Oenanthe Crocata is a delicate, deadly art. The poison is most concentrated in the tubers, the roots that look deceptively like parsnips. If eaten raw, they kill quickly. But Elara needed precision. She needed the toxin to be undetectable in taste, but overwhelming in effect. She spent the next 2 weeks in the abandoned greenhouse, distilling the roots. She crushed the white fibers, extracting a milky, resinous juice. As she heated the extract over a low flame, the chemical structure of the toxin Oenanthe toxin began to stabilize. It released a distinct aroma. To anyone else it might have smelled like parsnips or celery, but concentrated, it took on a sickly sweet scent, like overripe peaches mixed with the sharp tang of sulfur. She tested a single drop on a rat she had caught in the barn. The result was chemically perfect. The Risus Sardonicus, the sardonic smile. The toxin caused the muscles of the jaw and neck to contract violently, pulling the lips back, exposing the teeth, and freezing the face in a mask of eternal mocking joy. It was the ultimate insult to Silas Sterling. By November 14th, the smiling poison was ready. The date was significant. It was Silas Sterling's 60th birthday. A grand dinner was planned. The best wine from the cellar had been brought up to breathe. The cook had prepared a roast duck with peach glaze, a perfect mask for the scent of the toxin. Elara, dressed in her finest black servant's uniform. She slipped the vial into her apron pocket. She checked her reflection in the mirror. She didn't smile. She saved that for the dead. The stage was set. The storm of the century was battering the Georgia coast, drowning out any screams that might come from the main house. And inside, the Sterling family was sitting down to their last meal. The clock on the mantel struck 8 p.m. Thunder rattled the window panes, but inside, the only sound was the scraping of silver knives against fine china. Silas Sterling was in a foul mood. He poked at the roast duck on his plate, complaining that the peach glaze was too sweet, unaware that the sweetness was the only thing masking the bitter taste of his own demise. His sons, drunk on the expensive Bordeaux, were arguing in hushed tones about gambling debts. Victoria stared blankly at the centerpiece, lost in a medicated haze. Elara moved around the table like a shadow. She held a crystal decanter of wine, refilling glasses with a steady hand. She didn't pour the poison into the food. She had learned from her experiments with the rats that the stomach acid could delay the effects. Instead, she had spiked the wine decanter itself. Alcohol would carry the Oenanthe toxin straight into the bloodstream. Silas took a long, heavy draught of his wine. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and looked at Elara. For the first time in 6 months, He actually saw her. The wine tastes turned, he growled. Elara didn't flinch. It is a rare vintage, sir. It has a complex finish. One by one, they drank. And then, the silence began to change. It started with Theodore, the eldest son. He dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against the plate, a sound that would usually make Silas furious. But Silas didn't yell. He couldn't. Silas was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He tried to stand up to reprimand his son, but his legs refused to obey. The neurotoxin was attacking the spinal cord, severing the connection between the brain and the muscles. "Father," Theodore whispered, his voice strangled. "My face, it hurts." Theodore's lips began to pull back. It wasn't a natural movement. It looked like invisible hooks were dragging the corners of his mouth toward his ears. The muscles in his neck bulged as he fought against the spasm, but the toxin was stronger. He began to smile, a wide, toothy, unnatural grin that stretched the skin until it looked translucent. Panic erupted in Silas Sterling's eyes. He looked at his wife. The woman who had been miserable for 20 years was now beaming at him with a grotesque expression of ecstasy. Tears were streaming down her face, but her mouth was locked in a rictus of joy. Silas tried to scream. He tried to command his family to stop this mockery, but when he opened his mouth, no sound came out, only a wheezing gasp, and then he felt it. The tightening in his jaw, the spasm in his cheeks. The man who had banned laughter was now being forced to perform it. His lips curled up, exposing his yellowed teeth. His cheeks punched up. He was grinning. He was grinning at his dying wife. He was grinning at his paralyzed sons. Elara stepped forward from the shadows. She didn't check their pulses. She didn't need to. She simply walked to the head of the table and stood directly in front of Silas. "You demanded silence," she whispered, her voice calm and cold. "So I have given you a joke that leaves you breathless." She watched as delight faded from his eyes. The terror remained frozen in his pupils, forever clashing with the joy on his lips. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the house had finally achieved the perfect silence Silas had always wanted. Elara didn't run. She didn't rush. She walked to the back door, put on her coat, and stepped out into the rain. The water washed away the sulfur smell from her hands. She walked past the slave quarters, past the weeping willow, and vanished into the Georgia night. By the time the sun rose, Elara was gone. No record of a nurse named Elara was ever found in Charleston or Savannah. The authorities searched for months, but she had ghosted into history, leaving behind only 5 smiling corpses and a mystery that would terrify the South for a century. The Sterling Plantation never recovered. After the funeral's closed casket, of course, to hide the gruesome expressions of the deceased, the property fell into ruin. The locals claimed that on stormy nights, you could still hear laughter coming from the dining room. Not joyful laughter, but the pained, breathless gasping of men trying to scream. Sheriff Elias Thorne, the man who broke down the door, burned his uniform 3 days later. In his resignation letter, he wrote only one line: "There are things in this world that justice cannot touch, and perhaps that is for the best." The file on the Sterling murders was sealed by the state of Georgia, buried deep in the archives to protect the reputation of one of the South's wealthy families. The official cause of death was listed as accidental food poisoning, but the people of Savannah knew the truth. They whispered about the smiling poison and the woman who vanished into the rain. Botanists today confirm that Oenanthe Crocata still grows wild in the marshlands of Georgia. It remains one of the most deadly plants in North America, a beautiful white-flowered killer that leaves its victims with a permanent mocking grin. And this brings us to the question that has haunted this legend for over 150 years. Elara committed a cold-blooded, premeditated massacre. She wiped out an entire bloodline in a single night, but she did it to stop a lifetime of torture, abuse, and cruelty. So, I ask you, was Elara a monster who deserved to be caught? Or was she a dark angel of justice who did what the law refused to do? Tell me your verdict in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit the like button. It helps us find more lost stories from the archives. And if you are brave enough to explore more dark chapters of history with us, subscribe and ring the bell. We have uncovered another diary from 1892 about a doctor who claimed he could cure death. You won't want to miss that one. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never trust a smile that doesn't reach their eyes.